In writing about the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, Roger Ebert had this to say about the original. In 1968, George Romero made a scruffy little low-budget horror film named Night of the Living Dead, and it was truly frightening. That was in the days before the MPAA rating system, and I saw it at a Saturday matinee filled with little kids who were so scared they were screaming and weeping. I noted their reaction in my review. I believe then and now that some films are simply not appropriate for children, but at the same time I had to admire the artistry of Romero's film. With grainy black and white photography, a handful of locations and a cast of unknowns, he created a horrifyingly original vision that has been ripped off ever since, not least by Romero himself. The living dead in the movie were zombies who lurched about the landscape, their bodies decaying, their eyes blank, attempting to feed on human flesh. They had been dead, but their motor impulses and animal needs had somehow brought them back to a sickening parody of life, and now the only way to kill them was to destroy their brains. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Mel.
Lisa is out sick today. This is the second episode in our series of zombies, so it might be helpful to start with episode 8. Well, we led in with this quote from Roger Ebert, which is a slight break from our normal tradition, but I thought it was a nice kind of setup and introduction to talking about the kind of zombies that I think people are going to be most familiar with. I think in our last episode, talking about voodoo and Caribbean zombies might have thrown people who weren't familiar with the topic for a little bit of a loop. Maybe they would have been expecting us to start with Night of the Living Dead. But I definitely wanted to start with that quote from Ebert because I think it really does show just how influential Night of the Living Dead and George Romero were in completely changing around this genre.
You know, when I was reading the intro there about these little children watching this movie, it really got me thinking. And also, I think, Matt, we talked about this in our pre-episode discussion. It got me thinking about how in the 1960s, when you had horror movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon, for example, or you think of other ones, The Beginning of the End, I think was the one with the giant grasshoppers, and various kind of Vincent Price horror movies that we've talked about before in a bonus episode. I could totally understand why in 1968 or 69 parents would drop off little children to see the matinee horror film, but what they saw was just in some ways kind of realistic, with the grainy black and white photography, the just regular settings that you could think of being in, the cemetery, the house, the use of the television and the radio, almost like Orson Welles' War of the Worlds type idea that this is more of a global thing than or national thing than just where they are in the house. The zombies eating the body parts on the screen. I mean, this movie would be a real shocker to kids, especially, who are used to seeing something completely different on the movie screen on Saturday afternoon.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you mentioned Creature from the Black Lagoon, and for those of you who've seen it, I mean, it's a guy in a rubber suit, and I mean, I imagine at that time when it came out, if you're 8 or 9 watching this, there might have been that element of fear that it inspired, but it certainly wasn't something that was probably going to linger with you the way these gore-drenched, cannibalistic zombie things would be. I mean, they literally were eating flesh and eating intestines and, all that sort of stuff, which is just above and beyond what you'd expect in that like 1950s, 1960s Saturday afternoon matinee kind of horror movie.
Oh, yeah. And you think of the idea of the kind of low budget aspects of it, but I think in some ways that makes it more scary, right? Because you don't have to put someone in a silly suit where people are like, oh, that's a person in a Creature from the Black Lagoon suit, or though those are grasshoppers or ants that are just made to look bigger than they actually are. You just have people who look like they came up out of the grave and they are the threat. I don't know, that seems more immediate to me, and it doesn't require a huge makeup budget.
I mean, you mentioned what we talked about in the pre-episode discussion, but I think one of the great things about Night of the Living Dead in particular is how much Romero and his team did with so little. I mean, this is a low-budget movie for the time period, and it's low budget by our standards now, for sure. and yet it holds up remarkably well. Sometimes the acting is not as good as it probably could have been if they'd had the budget for some better actors, but the gore, the writing, the special effects, I mean, the movie itself holds up remarkably well, even rewatching it today.
It does, and one of the things that I think it also does really well is just that kind of stripped down humanity in the house. Like you focus on these people who are trying to survive. So all you really need is that house and them trying to board it up and them interacting with each other. And so that stripped down feel that we keep mentioning, it's like all I need is a cemetery. Like all I need is a house to put these people in and see what happens when the stress levels go up. You don't necessarily need the payoff of all the violence and the gore, though that is there. It's almost just as terrifying to be with those people in the house waiting for that moment to come while you're watching the television or you're listening to the radio or you're boarding up the house. You know what I mean? It's like they're like amping up the kind of stress and fear level, but it doesn't require the special effects.
Oh, definitely. It was a nice workaround on their part to not have to have as many special effects by focusing on the interior of the house so much. Well, I think one thing, too, to talk about with this movie is, and I mentioned it kind of in that introduction after the credits or whatever you want to call them, is just how important this movie really is for what we consider zombies, because this is the birth of the modern zombie movie. Before 1969 and before this movie came out, if you said the word zombie, it referred to voodoo, it referred to magic, and it referred to a place like Haiti. And after this movie, it refers to these undead horde of cannibals, basically. And I mean, it all goes back to this movie.
Well, I also thought it was interesting in the movie, they don't call them zombies, they call them ghouls, right? And, I thought it was really cool that, I mean, I don't know for sure if Romero is doing this, but the origin of the idea of a ghoul, I think it comes from Arabian folklore, Middle Eastern folklore, but it's a creature that lives in cemeteries and burial locations because it likes to feast on dead bodies, like dig them up and eat them. And I just thought that was really interesting that this is the transition from what we might traditionally think of in supernatural folklore as a ghoul type figure to what is ultimately going to become the kind of zombie figure we think of today with Walking Dead or 28 Days Later. It's very much a transition piece in that way as well.
Right. And I've seen interviews with Romero, and he talks about how they never used the word zombie in Night of the Living Dead. They used the word ghoul. He never mentioned the Arabian folklore connection that you mentioned there, but I mean, I have to imagine that he was at least aware of it, because like you said, the word ghoul seems to perfectly fit what these things were at the time, and it really wasn't until later that they started calling them zombies. I want to say it would have been probably Dawn of the Dead, but I'm even struggling to remember if they used the word zombie in that one either. But yeah, I mean, this is the birth of the modern zombie movie. I mean, when you talk about zombies like 28 Days Later or The Walking Dead, well, 28 Days Later is kind of on the fence for me, but we can get to that at another point.
Right. We'll have to push that off a little bit.
But yeah, you talk about Walking Dead or any of the zombie movies that people are familiar with, and I mean, they all go straight back to this movie, this idea of the cannibal, the idea of this virus that spreads, that you get bitten and you turn into this thing. I mean, that was brand new. That was not something that anybody else had done before. And I always did find it interesting that Romero was not using the word zombie at the time, because in my mind, zombie was always linked with this thing. And it wasn't really until I started doing research into this that I uncovered, well, like you said, that they were ghouls instead of zombies.
Something that I was going to ask you about, Matt, you were talking about how there's kind of a virus aspect to the zombies in this one, which if I'm remembering correctly, I just rewatched the movie and it seems like the little girl is sick the whole movie, but they don't understand that the zombies, it's a virus type thing. It's a surprise at the end, not maybe to the watcher, but to the people in the movie, that she, they just think she's sick because she was bitten, not that she's going to become a zombie. But isn't the reason that they give in the movie that it's a radiation type sickness, that there's some sort of satellite that did it, like a satellite that was supposed to go to Venus and come back, and it ends up bringing back this bizarre disease.
It is, and that's the sort of thing that I think at the time they were just sort of playing around with in Night of the Living Dead as a possible explanation, because it is mentioned on one of those radio broadcasts at the beginning that this satellite has fallen down nearby. And so it could be this external alien virus thing, but none of the further movies that Romero did ever really address that. They always just treat the zombie threat as something that is ongoing and happening, and never really offer an explanation as to the source or where it came from, which I've always really liked that about Romero's. Like, no, it doesn't matter where the zombies came from. They're here, and the survivors have to deal with it. So who cares about what causes it? Or, you know, what that immediate first cause was. They've got to survive, and that's more important.
Yeah. I think it makes it scarier, too, you know, that kind of upping that level of the unknown, you know, not knowing where it's coming from. I was wondering if, I don't know, the down satellite thing, and thinking of a movie in the late 60s, makes me wonder if they were trying to tap into space race anxieties, and maybe even, you know, kind of our competition with Russia at the time, and surveillance and that sort of thing. I don't know. I mean, I know it's kind of a stretch and it's very oblique, but I just thought it was interesting to use something like that, even if it's in the background.
Oh, I think it's definitely there. I mean, this is coming out of the time period where, like you said, you've got the space race, the walking on the moon is, you know, in very recent memory. I mean, this is 1969, so I think it's drawing on a lot of stuff. I mean, you've also got the monster movies from the 50s and 60s that were based not just on the space race, but that idea of invasion, that there's a lot of fear of invasion movies that were really being played out in sci-fi with alien invasions. But I mean, you could really trace it back to the fear of invasion from Russia. And I think with the idea of satellites and Sputnik and, you know, getting a man on the moon and all of that, I mean, I definitely think that was going on in that zeitgeist at the time. And so this is tapping into those sorts of fears that people have.
Yeah, the technology and satellites and, you know, travel into space is great, but it kind of goes back to what we talked about with the Lovecraftian idea of the unknown. What alien disease could you possibly bring back with you? Or what enemy, whether it's, you know, the Soviet Union or an alien, could use your technology against you? And yeah, I mean, during this time, you had all sorts of science fiction films, in particular, playing with this idea of the Red Scare, the House, was it the Un-American Activities Committee in the House, Invasion of the Body Snatchers comes to mind. Even The Day the Earth Stood Still, even though that was in the early 50s. Was it Earth versus the Flying Saucers, I think, came out in the mid-50s too, that the kind of like invasion by aliens. So yeah, I mean, thinking about these sci-fi and horror movies that led up to Night of the Living Dead, I see in the movie kind of this fear of an outside horror, but there also seems to be an internal horror too, which that may make it even more terrifying to do both.
Well, definitely. And one of the things that was the most unexpected influences that George Romero has often cited as an influence on Night of the Living Dead was not one of these external invasion sort of things, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or those other like 50s and 60s alien invasion movies, but was actually Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And at first, I didn't really see the connection between Psycho and Night of the Living Dead, but Romero has defined it as what he calls an internal horror. And that actually starts to make sense if you think about it, that the fear is not necessarily this external thing. It's not always this horde of zombies that are going to come and eat you. It's the fear of that monster next door sort of thing. That's where Norman Bates was so scary, was he looks like a normal person until he kills the woman in the shower. And then you realize, oh, this is the psycho. And you mentioned the scene with the daughter in the basement in Night of the Living Dead, and that's where that internal horror happens. The fact that the killer, the potential source of your death, could be anybody who's been bitten. It could be your neighbor. It could be your mother. It could be your best friend. Once they get bitten, they get turned into this thing, and it doesn't matter. They're going to be coming for you. You
know, you mentioned that Invasion of the Body Snatchers wasn't necessarily like a influence that Romero noted. But I think you kind of see that in Invasion of the Body Snatchers too, which of course is playing into that fear of either we're all going to be made to conform, or that, communists could be in your neighborhood right now, depending upon kind of how you're looking at it. But yeah, I mean, the main character in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, he's more creeped out by the fact that, like, his girlfriend seems to becoming whatever this is, and his friend is, and his neighbor, like, he doesn't know who he can trust, because these people who he thought of in these kind of friendly ways, that they were quote unquote normal, all of a sudden they're kind of taken over by or controlled by someone else. And the same thing with the daughter, like, this is a little girl, she's not going to be the one to murder us, or Barbara's brother Johnny, who kills her. These people that seem like they should be, like, safe, or they're our family, or, that sort of thing, all of a sudden becoming a horror to us. Like, anyone could turn into a zombie, anyone could become violent. There's no protection from it.
Right, absolutely. No one is safe, and nobody is safe, no matter who you are or where you are or anything. And that's sort of, you see it a lot in later zombie movies where someone gets bitten and ends up hiding it until it's too late. Now, either they reveal it just before they die and they're put down pretty quickly, or they end up transforming because maybe people still haven't quite realized yet that being bitten is the death sentence that it is. But it's a common thread of the person who gets bitten and then ends up hiding it for whatever reason. And I think that really plays into that internal horror. Now, that doesn't happen in Night of the Living Dead as much. Well, I mean, I guess it does with the daughter. One of the things that I've seen about Night of the Living Dead in particular that is so shocking is that it is this daughter, this kid who is seen as, normally children are portrayed as innocent and all of that. And she is the one that ends up bringing about the death of her parents because she turns into the zombie and kills them. And that's that internal horror right there, that they weren't expecting to be killed by their own daughter.
And then she eats the father. I mean, it turns that child into just a complete horror, into a complete other figure. And I think this goes back to some of the stuff we talked about with haunted houses, with the uncanny, right? I mean, someone who is supposed to be your daughter, like, when she kills her mom is literally, like, calling her baby, this is your mom, and why are you doing, I mean, it's really disturbing, not just because, she's killing her mother with a garden trowel, but because she's killing her mother and she's this little child. And I know when we talked about the uncanny, creepy children came up a lot, because you don't want to think that your brother or your sister or your child or your mother, for instance, are, capable of that kind of violence, or even if they are, that they would turn against you. It kind of turns that intimate, loving relationship that you have on its head and victimizes you with something that you originally thought was safe and good.
Another one of those common zombie threads that you see in the movies all the time is when somebody gets bit and they have one of the other survivors kill them because they don't want to become one of those things. I don't want to turn into that. I don't want to be one of those things. But what's really interesting is there's this great academic article. It's written by a philosopher. It's called "She's Not Your Mother Anymore, She's a Zombie." And there's a whole series of pop culture and philosophy books. There's Batman and philosophy, and Lord of the Rings and philosophy, Harry Potter and philosophy. Well, there's also undead and philosophy. And this one, it tackles vampires as well as zombies, so it's not just focused on zombies. But this particular article is all about zombies. And it's talking about those same exact things that you're bringing up, this idea of personal identity and when is a person no longer a person anymore? And they really use that idea of zombies to talk about things like if you have, catastrophic brain damage and you are completely being kept alive by machines, there's no higher brain activity, are you a person or not? And they use the article to kind of raise these questions without answering them, because it's a hard question to answer. But the question of zombies, it really does kind of have this interesting idea, though, of, is this reanimated corpse the same as the person it was before? And anyone who's seen a zombie movie will say no, because we're not cannibals and we're not spreading this disease through a bite and, all of that. But you always see that person in the zombie movie who just can't kill the zombie because it is their mother, or it is their brother or whoever, and they end up getting bitten too because they just can't let it go. I've always found that interesting.
Yeah, I think for me, that in some ways, the way the zombie kind of twists personal relationships is like an extra part of the terror. And I know this is kind of going back a little bit, but if anybody's familiar with Ambrose Bierce's writing, he had a short story, The Death of Halpin Frasier, in the mid to late 1800s. And some people claim that that is kind of an early zombie story because you have this man, Halpin Frasier, who ends up in this weird kind of terrifying dreamscape scenario, being killed possibly by the reanimated corpse of his mother. And that's kind of, Halpin can't run away, even though he's terrified of this, because, yeah, it's his mother. So it's like you're looking at your mother thinking, this person isn't going to hurt me, but yet you're also terrified because if this person is dead and is moving again, is it really a person? Is it really your mother? Is this an evil kind of demon or a ghoul? And how do you, I don't know, that's like that moment of indecision. Like you're drawn to the person because you're like, oh my God, it's my mother and I can't believe this happened. I'd like to help her. But then, yeah, your mother is an evil, soulless, husk of a human being who's going to kill you. And that is terrifying. It's not just kind of internal horror. It's also taking the things that make us feel most human and making them completely other to us, turning them into monsters that can then hurt us.
Well, one of the most interesting things throughout George Romero's film career, or at least his zombie film career, he's done several non-zombie movies as well, but one of the interesting things that he does is in some of the later movies, he starts really playing around with that idea of where that line is, particularly starting with Day of the Dead and into Land of the Dead. Some of the zombies actually become capable of some of what we would consider thought or intent or action. And there's a zombie in Day of the Dead who's being studied by the whole movie takes place pretty much in this missile silo, and it's army people for the most part, if I remember. It's been a while since I've seen that one. But there are some scientists, and one of them is studying this zombie that he names Bub. And Bub ends up, well, I don't really feel bad for a spoiler on a movie that's like 30 years old, but Bub ends up learning how to use tools. He ends up at the end, he escapes because there's a breach and the zombies get into this missile silo or whatever, and there's a villainous, like, I don't remember if he's a general or a colonel, but he's one of the higher up army people, and of course he's portrayed as this villain, and Bub ends up shooting him with a gun. And this is a zombie. And so, it's made very clear that the intention is deliberate because he salutes the guy at the end. If I remember correctly, it was because the colonel or whoever had not just been participating in the experiments on Bub, but had essentially been torturing him. And so it's this payback. And same with Land of the Dead. There's a zombie character who's almost like this ringleader who's able to organize the other zombies, and they follow him. And so George Romero really starts playing around with this idea of, yeah, so they're dead and they're undead, but they can also learn too. And a lot of them, starting with Dawn of the Dead, start returning back to their places that they were familiar with in their life. Land of the Dead opens in this sort of park, and there are zombie people in a marching band all holding their instruments, sort of reenacting this death scene of their own, where they're all holding their tubas and clarinets and stuff, and they're not playing, obviously, because they don't know how to play, but they're still holding them.
The mall in Dawn of the Dead, right? Like with that, they return to the place that they always were.
Exactly. And I guess before we move on from Night of the Living Dead in particular, I know we have other stuff to discuss in general about George Romero and these types of zombies, but I did want to mention two things. One is that most of George Romero's movies take place in and around Pittsburgh, which is where he's based, and so a lot of zombie enthusiasts have taken to calling these style of zombies Pittsburgh Zombies. So that's kind of where that term comes from. But we haven't really talked too much about this idea of contagion within these zombies. The fact that it is basically, if it's not a virus, it's spread like a virus. And there is this sort of the way it spreads is very similar to a virus.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say I didn't really know much about the idea of calling these zombies Pittsburgh zombies until you were talking about it. And I was reading an article, and evidently there are zombie tours in Pittsburgh. So I'm like, if anybody out there wants to take one, go for it. I bet it would be fun.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah. Maybe we should go and
I would
see what's going on.
I would absolutely love that.
Road trip. Yes. Contagion seems to be kind of the underlying cause of what's going on in Night of the Living Dead, if that makes sense. But, I mean, here's a question for you, Matt. When I was watching the movie, I was like waiting for him to explain to me why these people were becoming zombies, and it was to a certain extent, but I felt like the emphasis was more on being with the survivors and experiencing their emotions and their fears, if that makes sense. Like the idea of it being a contagion and the satellite idea that we talked about before wasn't in the forefront. It was more about like the psychology and the emotion and the interactions between these people in the house in real time as they get dribs and drabs of information. Does that make sense?
It does. I think the idea of contagion is something that was picked up and used in his later movies and by most of the other zombie movies that Night of the Living Dead spawned. But I mean, you see kind of the beginnings of it happening here, where if you get bitten, you get infected and you end up dying. And you really see it in later things. And for those of you who have not read it, this is really taken to an interesting level with Max Brooks's The Zombie Survival Guide. You might recognize the last name Brooks. Max Brooks is Mel Brooks' son, the great comedian. And he does this great sort of, it's tongue-in-cheek, but it's not tongue-in-cheek, survival guide to the zombies apocalypse. And it's actually a fantastic read. It's really worth reading. But he actually has the explanation that it is actually a virus that causes it. And it gets picked up in later movies, too. 28 Days Later, they call it the rage virus, which, yes, go ahead and roll your eyes now. Yes, it's a virus that causes rage. But that idea of spreading virally, I think, I agree with you that it's not in the forefront of Night of the Living Dead, for sure, but it was put forth there and other people later picked it up to the point where they're back in, at least 10 or 15 years ago, I don't remember how long it was, there was a website that was a zombie infection simulator, and you could kind of, I mean, it was just a little flash game sort of thing where you could play around with layout of a city sort of thing and play around with population density, and you had all these little pink dots, and you could start an infection at some point in there with a zombie, and it would be a green dot, and it moved slower, and it would slowly spread. And if you played around with different things like population density, I think there was a setting for panic where if one of the pink dots sees a green dot, then they get scared and start moving even faster. But no matter what you did, it spread exponentially, and it spread just like a virus does, was kind of the thing, is no matter what you did, the entire thing would eventually be taken over with green. There really weren't ever any survivors. It just depended on how long you let it run for. And that's something that I think in our modern day, I mean, we're terrified of infection.
Yes. Well, and the fact that it doesn't matter, like it's like you said, it's inevitable. It doesn't matter how long it takes, but everybody will get sick in this kind of connected world that we live in.
Right. And I mean, think about some of the fears that we've had of SARS, of bird flu, of swine flu. If you've ever seen the movie Contagion that came out recently, I think they give the statistic that, the normal person touches their face like 50 times in an hour and talk about wanting to bathe in bleach after that. Like,
well, I'm going to try really hard not to touch my face now.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think one of our fears that we have, at least in the industrialized world, is this fear of contagion. I think it's less likely to have that fear when you're in the third world, simply because there are far more pressing things like clean water and food and that sort of thing. We have the luxury of being able to be afraid of getting sick in a way that's not like drinking contaminated water sick. But I mean, it's definitely a phobia that a lot of people have. It may not be this crippling germophobia, but I think a lot of, I mean, how many people get their flu shots every year, and how many people get worried over going to airports and that sort of thing, like, oh, I don't like flying because I'm going to get sick. And zombie movies, I think, really tap into that.
Or like just the fear that we had of Ebola, even though we knew that it was very difficult to catch, just the fact that it crossed our borders was horrifying. And I think with zombies, there's an internal and an external horror there too, going back to what we were talking about earlier. The internal horror is that you could get the disease, like a contagion, but the external horror is that it's going to turn you into a zombie and you may eat someone else, like you have contagion and cannibalism wrapped up into one.
Yeah, it's not just a disease. It's not just going to make you sick. It's a disease that will inevitably kill you because there's never a cure for the zombie virus. It's always incurable. So it's 100% fatal, and when it's done with you, it's still not done because you're going to get back up and turn into this cannibal that's going to wander around until you decompose or get shot in the head, basically. That does not sound appealing to me.
Yeah, me neither. I'm not into that. But when you were talking, I was thinking another fear about zombies, and this is also an idea of uncanny, is that, and I guess it says vampires as well, but it violates our sense of time, right? Because in our normal lives, something happens to us and we will die, and then we assume it's done. But the zombie idea is almost like a form of like violent purgatory, right? Because like you said, like the zombies may kill you or you may get sick, but you will then come back after death and be doing horrifically terrible things. Like you not only lose your personality, but then you're like forced to continue past when you should have ended. Like there's something very terrifying just about our concept of life and death there. That's really scary as well. And I guess it goes back to ghosts and vampires too, but with a zombie, like you said, you're dead on the ground and then you get up. I don't know, there's something viscerally terrifying about that.
Well, and I think the main difference between a zombie style of undeath and a vampire style of undeath is that the vampires are always still look mostly human. They have their fangs, and they're definitely these predatory things, but they still look mostly human. And in zombie movies, you know that they're dead. And in later movies, and especially like The Walking Dead or the end of 28 Days Later or other movies, you see them in various states of decay. And The Walking Dead in particular is really good about giving you these really gruesome zombies that are, like there was one pit of zombies that they discover, I don't remember which season it's in, but they've been in a flooded basement basically for who knows how long, and they're mostly rotted away. And I think it forces you to sort of confront your mortality in a completely different way than vampires do, because yeah, we're all going to die and we're all going to decay. We're not going to get back up and be cannibals, but at some point we're going to look the way that those walkers in The Walking Dead looked. I try to avoid seeing dead bodies just in general. It's not something that I'm very comfortable with. I've been to a couple of funerals, and I think we all have this sort of distaste for it, but then confronting your mortality in that way is just, to see these things, it's pretty gross. And and to be forced to continue some sort of half-life in that condition is also terrifying too. Like it forces you to look at it, but it's also like there's just something unnatural about, well, like you said, if you are looking at a dead body and the person is dead, if they sit up all of a sudden or they start moving, there's something just kind of, unnatural is the only thing I can think of to say about it. It's something that like makes you face your mortality, but then it's like it's not done. Like there's some other force controlling you. And I think that element of unnaturalness gets carried on further with these reanimated zombies that George Romero started, because they keep going. They are incapable of feeling pain, so they keep going, and you get those hideous sounds of like the broken leg and they keep walking, or the broken neck and they keep going, and it's gross and disturbing, like just even remembering the sounds from those in different movies. But I think that leads to one of the things that I've always found that I think one of the most disturbing ideas to me about zombies is it's not the contagion, and it's not even this undeath. It's that complete unstoppable nature of them, that the zombies that are outside the farmhouse in Night of the Living Dead, or the zombies that are outside banging on the doors to get into the mall in Dawn of the Dead, they're not going anywhere. They know that there's people in there, and they're staying at the doors, and they're going to keep beating on that door until the door either comes down or their arm falls off, and then they'll just use their head, and then they'll just keep going and so even if you outrun the zombies, they're going to keep chasing you. It's sort of that Jason from Friday the 13th. He walks really slowly, but he's always going to catch up to you.
Right. That's what I was just thinking. It's like they could just stroll and you could be running like crazy, but eventually you're going to get tired or you're going to run out of gas and they will get you.
Right. Well, I mean, and you're going to get tired. You're going to run out of steam. You're going to not be able to run. You're going to need to sleep, and they'll keep walking. And you're going to need to find something to eat, and they'll keep coming. And it just doesn't end. And if you barricade yourself inside of somewhere, you may not be able to get back out because they're not going anywhere, and they're going to stay out there. And that's just, I mean, I always think about the end of Shaun of the Dead, where you've got this mass of arms banging on the windows of the Winchester pub. And that's just terrifying to me because there's no escape. Your
right.
only way out is death, either killing yourself so you don't turn into one of them or turning into one of them. And of course, that's not how Shaun of the Dead ends. But for most people, it seems like that is how it ends. That's how they get to be more zombies.
Or that moment in Night of the Living Dead when he kind of gets out of the house, but they're trying to get or he goes in the basement and they're trying to get in the basement after him. And they're picking up the same furniture and wood that he used to barricade and beating the door with it. I mean, they'll pick up each other and use them to beat on things. There's no ending. And just more and more people come because there's more dead people in the earth than there are living people, at any moment. So they just have tons of recruits and tons of material. It's terrifying.
Well, tons of recruits. I mean, yeah, for every person who dies is another one in their army, if you think of it that way.
Oh, yeah. And in Night of the Living Dead, people are coming out of cemeteries, too. So you've also got to contend with all the people who died recently,
Right. There's a great scene, the World War Z movie, which, if you've read the book, also by Max Brooks, the guy who wrote the Zombie Survival Guide. If you've read the book but haven't seen the movie, don't expect anything like the book. The book is incredible. It's amazing. The movie, very, very not like the book, but it's good in its own way. But there's a scene where there's just this mass of zombies outside a wall. I want to say it's in the Middle East, maybe Israel. It's been a while since I've seen that movie too. But basically, the zombies are climbing on top of each other to get over the wall. And it's not because they're working together. It's just you've got the ones at the bottom who...
And they just keep coming on top.
And they just keep coming, and they just keep coming, and they eventually get over the top of the wall because they just keep coming. And they don't care. They don't feel pain. It doesn't matter to them. So, yeah, I mean, it's just completely unstoppable and terrifying.
I was going to say it's almost like ants or some sort of insect, that it's almost like an infestation and they just keep coming and coming and coming. I don't know, that's what I was just thinking. Because I remember seeing that in the trailer for that movie, that scene. And it's almost like... I don't know. It's just like ants because there's so many of them and they don't care.
It really is just like that. I mean, if you've seen, there's a video that was floating around social media a couple of weeks ago of how ants can be used like essentially building. And they use it in the movie Ant-Man too, where enough ants kind of bound together turn into this raft. And that's sort of what they do. So, well, one last thing that I kind of wanted to bring up in this brings us full circle back to Night of the Living Dead properly, is the idea of race. And what's really interesting, and what people have talked a lot about with regards to Night of the Living Dead, is the casting, that one of the main actors, the guy who played Ben, is African American. And again, this is 1969. This is civil rights era, 1960s, and you've got one of the main leads in a movie like this being cast who's African American. And what I found interesting is George Romero himself said that they weren't doing it as a political statement or anything of that nature. They cast him because he just happened to be the best actor that they found for the role. And I think that says a lot about George Romero and himself, that he just wasn't even thinking of race as a factor whatsoever. He's like, I just went with the guy who could act the best. But people have, after the fact, made a lot to do about that, about how that really did break down this sort of barrier. I mean, it didn't knock down all the walls and completely revamp Hollywood, but it really was an important sort of thing about the movie.
Yeah, when I was rewatching it recently, I was thinking to myself, it's not just that this African-American man is the main character per se, and that he kind of becomes a leader, and he survives, but it's also the way the other characters treat him in the movie. At the time, I would say, even in apocalyptic movies where there's only a couple people left on Earth, usually what movies treat is how the race relations will continue because they're so socialized, if you know what I mean. And in the movie, there is no argument that seems racially motivated in the movie, if that makes sense. Like, the woman and him work together. The argument between the two about who's going to be the leader is more about like their ideas and how they have better survival in one area or another. It really is like just a bunch of people all together in this stressful situation, and his race doesn't really enter into their discussions in the movie itself. Like, it's just these people in the house trying to survive.
Definitely. And I think in the time between that movie and Dawn of the Dead, which is almost, if not exactly 10 years, I think it's 9 years between the two, you see Romero, I think, actually tackle it a little bit more in the second one, possibly because of people's discussions of the race issue in Night of the Living Dead. But in the opening scene of Dawn of the Dead, there's a house that's under siege by the Pittsburgh police because there's gangs in there, and I think it's a drug-selling gang or something like that. And there happens to be zombies in the basement and in several of the other apartments. But one of the cops loses his mind and just starts shooting people randomly. Well, not randomly. He's white, and he starts shouting a bunch of racial slurs and shooting people of different races, the Hispanics and African Americans there. And he ends up being shot by one of the main characters of the movie, which is an African American cop. And nobody really says anything about him shooting the racist guy. And I think it is very telling that character, the African American, is one of the few that survives through to the very end of the movie. So I've always wondered if perhaps that was Romero going just a little step further and saying, no, like, racism is stupid because look at this stupid racist cop. And he's very careful to show that he's the only racist cop. He's not saying all cops are racist, but just this one in particular happened to be and was using his position of power to kill people of different races, but all the other cops are not. And so no one has a problem with him being shot. So yeah, I've always wondered if that was just a Romero's kind of final response to the issues of race brought forth in Night of the Living Dead, unintentionally, I think. Yeah,
because I mean, we've talked in this podcast even, and I'm sure we will in coming ones, about how unfortunately people are scared of things that are different than them, or people who are different from them. And so often in horror, we have, women or people of color becoming, especially in, 50s, 60s, 70s horror, the kind of the dangerous aspect of the movie, or even misunderstood. And Night of the Living Dead and doesn't play with that trope at all, really. The other is the ghouls. The other is not the people inside the house. And I just thought that was really interesting, that these men and women, even of different races, can barricade themselves inside the house and fight the monster that's outside, whatever that may symbolize at that time.
Well, I guess that sort of covers everything that we wanted to talk about. I mean, really, this episode is not meant to be just a pure tribute to the amazingness of George Romero, but that's kind of what it sounds like. But really, if you're thinking of zombies and you're thinking of especially The Walking Dead or any zombie movie, I think you really do have to talk about George Romero and Night of the Living Dead and how important that movie really is for cinema, in particular horror cinema. Our next episode, we're going to be moving away from just George Romero and talking about modern day zombies, sort of what we're calling almost Romero's legacy. And we'll definitely get more in depth about films like 28 Days Later, The Walking Dead, and possibly even some of the zombie comedy movies that have been made. So we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
This is the No Fear podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or on our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send us an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get exclusive access to many episodes, released on the weeks in between our normal schedule. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.